so this is on the current political situation in the U.S. And in order to understand that, I think we have to look back a little bit of history and a little bit of overall economic and global situation, of which obviously I'm only going to touch on because can't go into everything. But so the macro situation is that the U.S. is still the dominant imperialist power in the world. However, it is being challenged, especially by China, but also by other groups. It is challenged both economically and militarily. And of course, in the background of all this is a climate crisis, which could possibly mean the end of civilization, et cetera. The macroeconomic situation is that there have been declining profit rates up to the early and mid-'70s, which led to the onset of neoliberalism in the mid-'70s. This was intensified by the 2008 to 9 global Great Recession, which raised pressure on the ruling class. The policies that they pursued from the 1970s on were deregulation, lower tax rates on the rich, privatization, cuts in social programs, resistance of unions. The severe enforcement of neoliberalism took place in the global south through the IMF loans, et cetera, but it also impacted the north. The results were a massive rise in the profit share within just looking at the U.S. economy. It's true in other, across the world, but especially in the U.S. economy, there was a massive rise in the profit share compared to the wage share of the economy. There's an increased concentration of wealth. However, this succeeded in what the ruling class wanted to do. They wanted to concentrate wealth, but that didn't solve their problem. It doesn't solve the underlying tendency to crisis within capitalism, nor does it solve the tendency for the rate of profit to decline. And there are some specific reasons why that is that we can get into discussion. It helps ameliorate, and raise the rate of profit, but it doesn't really solve the crisis. So just in terms of economic statistics, we all know this, we know about the concentration of wealth, but to look at some of the statistics, it's pretty astonishing when you think about it. The top 500 corporations had a CEO to worker pay before 1980 of 40 to 1. So the top CEO would be paid 40 times as the average worker for that company. Today, that ratio is 670 to 1. The U.S. minimum wage in 1968, based on, if you translated it into 2022 dollars, would have been $12.12. Today, it is $7.25. The top marginal tax rate on the richest people in the country in the 1950s was over 90%. Today, it is 27%. In 1990, the top 1% owned 17% of the wealth in the U.S. Today, they own 27% of the wealth. The middle 20% of the population owned 12% of the wealth in 1990. Today, they only own 7% of the wealth. There have been some estimates that in the U.S., there was an actual $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 1% over the last few decades. Worldwide, there's been a transfer of $152 trillion from the global south to the global north. As of last October, 745 US billionaires are $5 trillion richer than they were before the pandemic. Labor share of wealth in the economy in 1950 was 65%. In 2016, it was down to 57%. So what we've seen as a result of all this concentration of wealth is a stagnating and declining living standards, while productivity is way up. So workers are producing more, but they're actually getting less. There have been deteriorating social programs, increases in racism and sexism, the deterioration of women's position in terms of affirmative action and abortion rights even before the Dobbs decision, a rising incarceration rates for Black people and other people of color, declining affirmative action for people of color, declining living standards, increased class polarization. Even the new middle class and the petty bourgeoisie have seen declining real incomes as well. Rising homelessness, rising precarity, that is not knowing how long your job's going to last, etc. The squeeze on the petty bourgeoisie has led to rising discontent in that sector. There has been class collaboration by union leaders with declining unionization. There's been a lower level of strikes even compared to the 1980s, which were not that great. Although recently there's been an uptick of strikes, but we're still not back to the 1980 levels. There's been recently encouraging union organizing drives and some strikes. But overall, there's been a shift to the right by both the Democrats and the Republicans. We've seen the decline of affirmative action. Under Bill Clinton, we saw the, quote, end of welfare as we know it, austerity, squeeze on school budgets, etc. There's been a whittling away of abortion rights with more and more restrictions even before the Dobbs decision. The politics of the ruling class and the masses have polarized. Both the Democrats and Republicans have shifted to the right. The Democrats have followed and sometimes led the ruling class. In the 1990s, we had the Democratic Leadership Council under Bill Clinton and Al Gore, which kind of led the charge to the right within the Democratic Party. So the political polarization we've seen has been both at the top and the bottom. At the top, sections of the ruling class, that is mostly the smaller big bourgeoisie, people who are best represented by somebody like Mike Lindell, the pillow guy, small capitalist, but a capitalist. They want even more and more conservative policies. Some of them are willing to accept quasi-constitutional measures to achieve deregulation, lower tax rates, etc. This section of the ruling class want to increase the rate of exploitation by dividing the masses further. So they want to use things like anti-trans bills and so forth, anti-gay, anti-immigrants, tax on CRT, tax on teachers, teaching the truth in school and that kind of thing. At the bottom of the population, we've seen sections of the petty bourgeoisie going crazy. So we see QAnon, we see all the the right-wing developments of militias and all that kind of stuff. This is because of the declining economic and social position. Some, of course, don't want to exaggerate this. Some have joined fascist and quasi-fascist groups. This has been especially true of white men who've combined their loss of status with racism, sexism, and misogyny. So now, this is the other point that we sometimes pessimistically forget, and that is that large numbers of people have also moved to the left. There's close to majorities of younger people who support socialism, whatever that socialism means to them. On social issues, the majority of people are to the left. They support abortion rights, support gay rights, support some immigrant rights. They believe that wealth should be more evenly distributed, etc. Just a comment on January 6th and Trumpism. Trumpism is a reflection of the authoritarian turn internationally in sections of the ruling class, which is in turn a response to the crisis of neoliberalism. We have Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, etc. So Trump is one example of this. Trump wanted to put forward a retreat from U.S. leadership in terms of imperialism and have a more transactional one-on-one approach of agreements with different states. The reason for this is that the profit squeeze is greater, especially, again, on the smaller big bourgeoisie. And so they want more of a crackdown. This is reinforced by and reinforces petty bourgeois reaction, the MAGA crowd, and within that, the fascists. January 6th, 2021 was a combination of crazed petty bourgeoisie, right-wingers, led by a deranged sociopath. and sections of the ruling class willing to go along with this, at least to some extent. It was an expression of white supremacy and an attack on voting rights. The ruling class today is divided. Almost none of them want an actual end to constitutional democracy. Even fewer want a fascist solution at this point. The bourgeoisie, the bourgeois Democrats, bourgeois democracy has worked very well for the big bourgeoisie for the most part. The right-wing capitalists, again, mostly the smaller capitalists, will use and flirt with the petty bourgeois right-wing, the fascists and quasi-fascists. The talk of defunding the FBI, for example, I believe is completely and totally talk. They're not really going to try to do that. The majority of the ruling class and the state support constitutionalism. They are prosecuting the insurrectionists of January 6th. There's the uproar around Mar-a-Lago. These are both signs of this. The constitutionalist wing will consolidate around the Democrats. The Lincoln Project, et cetera, different sections of the old Republican establishment have gone over to support or quasi-support of the Democrats, or at least around these constitutional issues. This will mean that the Democratic Party will be pulled even further to the right as sections of these Republicans come into or around the Democratic Party. There's a division in the ruling class over immediately, cutting taxes, regulation, and so forth, versus more long-term planning. So the Republicans are more short-term, the Democrats are more long-term. However, there are overlaps between them, and it's not like a strict division. There are, divisions in the ruling class. The Democratic Party is on a right-wing trajectory. The economic crisis will continue to compel austerity. The Democratic wing of the ruling class doesn't see the need to further divide people by attacks on trans people, abortion, CRT, etc. And it may even use these Republican attacks as a way to win more votes than Democrats. However, they share the need to move to the right, so they're not about to actively defend people either. As a really good example of this is they had 49 years to codify Roe versus Wade. In many of those years, they had full majorities in Congress and president and so forth, and they never did it. They basically wanted to preserve it as an electoral thing they could use. The Democratic Party appeals to liberal sentiment electorally, which is a majority sentiment in terms of issues and so forth, but there's little to put it into practice. Both the Democrats and Republicans agree on imperialism, and that includes the Squad and Bernie and all that. So just to go through some of the latest things that have happened, we have the Inflation Reduction Acts, which on climate is mostly a tax credit thing rather than direct investment in better climate policies. It will also include, ultimately, as a counterpoint, easier permitting for fossil fuels. So it claims to be a real step forward on climate, yet it has the poison pill within it. The minimum tax on corporations is good, but at 15% is way below what it used to be, 20, 30, 40 years ago. There'll be some control of drug prices, which is good, but that's in some ways a division in the ruling class, because some sections of the ruling class will be able to use lower drug prices as a way to cut wages, because people won't have to spend as much money on drugs. Medicare, the $35 insulin thing is a step forward, but again, it doesn't cover anybody who's not on Medicare. So the idea that people can still go bankrupt because they have to buy insulin or have to cut their doses is still there. It just shows the cruelty of the system. The Democrats claim to want to make these kind of improvements, but they won't end the filibuster to do it. So just looking really quick at the Mar-a-Lago thing, I believe it is a sideshow for the left. Liberals are focused on national security. They're all concerned about these documents and what's going to happen. And there's dirt on Macron in France, and what is he going to say? And if this gets out, and blah blah blah. But it's something the left should reject. We do not support national security, and we should not. That's something that ought to be really clear. National security means war. it means repression, it means jailing whistleblowers, it means all sorts of stuff. So there are plenty of reasons to hate Trump, but this is not one of them. So why are the Democratic Party and the liberals pushing around this? Well, the Democrats want to use it for elections, of course, but all of the ruling class is into national security. Liberals, conservatives, all of them. Trump, in his craziness, is a bit of an outlier, but in general, the ruling class is very concerned with national security, even if the Republicans claim rhetorically to push it aside a little bit right now. We need to respond to some of the narratives in the media. One trope is that Trump is a fascist. Trump is not a fascist. Under Trump, the state checked him to some extent, and we could still organize openly. We did not live under fascism. January 6th prosecutions, the FBI search of Mar-a-Lago, etc., shows that the ruling class, big sections of the ruling class, want to maintain the constitutional order. Another idea on that they're put forward in the media is that this is maybe the 5th or 7th or 10th time that this election is the most important election in your lifetime, because they say it means whether we have democracy or authoritarianism. You got to elect the Democrats because that's the only way to authoritarianism, which is all a bunch of bullshit because the U.S. is not a democracy in the first place. A Princeton study recently, or a few years ago, showed that it was an oligarchy, and then we have very many structural features within the economy, within the state structure, which stop it from being a democracy. The constitutional order is not at stake. Even the right wing of the ruling class is not ready to really junk it. The U.S. Supreme Court shift to the right is not primarily a Federalist Society coup. It is primarily a reflection of the ruling class move to the right. The solution is not packing the court, but mass struggle. Mass struggle is what wins reforms. So the revolutionary socialist approach must be that both wings of the ruling class are committed to a retooled neoliberal situation strategy. They're both committed to raising the rate of exploitation. Neither wing supports the interests of ordinary people. That means the left needs to have an independent policy with no political support to either party. We need to oppose the right wing and fascist mobilizations, but without implying support for the Democrats. We need to impose all imperialist moves, Cold War with China, military spending, assassinations of Al-Qaeda leaders, etc. We need to support measures that help the working class without falling in line behind praise for the Democrats. We need to oppose all attacks on the oppressed. And this is important because it's not enough just to unite the working class around class-wide demands. You have to take up demands of special oppression, etc. We need to actively oppose the real potential source of fascism, which is the small group, what are called insurgent supremacists, as people want to overthrow the order and create a fascist-type society, such as the Oath Keepers, 3%, Proud Boys, all that kind of stuff. Most important, we need to understand that neoliberalism is not just a policy choice. It flows from capitalism and is carried out by both parties. In the short run, only mass struggle can push it back. We've had some real successes recently with the teachers, Red State Revolt, Black Lives Matter movement, limited successes there. Some recent contracts, rising strikes, etc. In the long run, the only way to end all the bad features of capitalism is not to tinker with it or reform it, but to abolish it. Therefore, we need a revolution, and it takes organization to bring that about. So our immediate lesson is that we need to build revolutionary organizations to influence the direction of struggle and make them more effective today, and to help lay the basis for a revolutionary socialist party. Thanks.